So, like Julie said, I'm going to be talking about ambiguous sentence processing and the effect of referential context in Spanish-English bilinguals. Before I got into the specifics of my project, I wanted to establish a few key things that we already know about sentence processing. And first, that is adult language processing is rapid, meaning that it happens very fast, and incremental, meaning that people do not wait till the end of the sentence to commit to the meaning of that sentence. Instead, they're processing the sentence as it's being spoken. Which brings me to the conflict resolutions that adults have had to adapt for the language processing. Sometimes there are multiple different ways that a phrase can be interpreted, and we call this an ambiguous phrase. And because this ambiguity exists, adult language processing must be flexible because when they make early commitments to the meaning of the sentence, they have to be able to revise that meaning that they're interpreting when they hear the completed sentence. To demonstrate an example of conflict resolution that someone might have to do, we can look at the phrase, put the frog on the napkin. When we see an image like this here on the right, there are two common interpretations of the phrase on the napkin. The first being on the napkin, describing the frog further, just giving more information about it, which is a modifier interpretation of that phrase. Or on the napkin can be interpreted as where you should be putting the frog, such as put the frog on this bottom napkin, which is the destination interpretation of the phrase on the napkin. However, if this phrase is paired with a different visual context, one interpretation is going to be supported over another. So if there's only one frog, we consider this a one referent context, and the destination interpretation of the phrase on the napkin is supported because when people hear put the frog on the napkin, they're not waiting for any more additional information about that frog. So they're just thinking put the frog on the napkin before the rest of the sentence is said. When there are two frogs, it's a two referent context, and the modifier interpretation is supported because people hear put the frog and they're wondering which frog. And then when you say on the napkin, they realize that you're talking about the frog that is actually on the napkin. So current literature suggests that English-speaking adults resolve ambiguity and are affected by the different referential contexts that they see. In this project, we're looking at Spanish-English bilinguals and their ability to resolve this ambiguity and the effect of referential context. We did this through recruiting Spanish-English bilinguals from the University of Puerto Rico. And similar to Olivia's experiment, we gave them a language history questionnaire, picture naming task, and verbal fluency tasks to ensure their levels of proficiency. This experiment was modeled partially after Truesdell's 1999 experiment, which included both one referent and two referent visual contexts, and both ambiguous and unambiguous sentences. So the ambiguous sentence example would be put the frog on the napkin onto the box, with again that on the napkin phrase being ambiguous, and the unambiguous sentence being put the frog that's on the napkin onto the box, and that's word creates the unambiguity. Like I just mentioned, it was partially modeled after Truesdell's 1999 experiment, but there were a few key differences, the most major of which being that ours was conducted completely online, while in Truesdell's experiment, the participants moved the physical objects to display their interpretation of the sentence. Truesdell's experiment was also conducted with English speakers, and this is with bilinguals. Oops. Sorry. So to administer the experiment, I used Google Sites, Zoom, and YouTube, similar to as we saw in Olivia's presentation. And participants were familiarized with the images of the experiment. So each image in the one referent or two referent condition would appear on the screen one at a time and was named out loud by an audio recording. Then the participant either heard an ambiguous or unambiguous sentence, giving an instruction about the display. Then the display would move and animation would be played, and the participant was asked to say yes if the display showed the correct movement following the instruction, or to say no if the animation was not showing the correct movement. During the entirety of the experiment, the eye movements of the Spanish-English bilinguals were recorded using their video camera on their computer. So this is an example of what a trial would look like from a participant's perspective.
Napkin, dog, guitar, zebra, napkin, kite, Put the dog on the napkin onto the kite.
And the participant would say yes or no.
Now drag it right.
And the participant would say yes or no again. So we had been intending to travel to Puerto Rico to collect this data using the iLink 1000 while having participants drag the objects on the computer themselves. But due to the COVID pandemic, we made adjustments to make everything online. Like I had mentioned before, we recorded the eye movements throughout the trials by recording the whole session using the participant's computer camera. And here is a wonderful example of our lab manager, Katrina, demonstrating looks to the top center, the bottom center, the left, and the right of the screen. When we analyzed the participants' eye movements, we did it frame by frame using ELAN to establish any patterns that might have existed. Also, when we presented the sentence to the participants, it was presented in 3 chunks, and we analyzed the eye movements following this chunk, or these chunks. So the first one, put the frog, that's on the napkin onto the box. And in our analysis, a 4th region of interest emerged. We call this the noun to spillover region. So to better understand how the Spanish-English bilinguals were parsing the sentence, we were looking at the proportion of fixations to each object on the screen. So in this graph, we have 1 referent context in black, the 2 referent contexts in red, the ambiguous conditions in a striped pattern, and the unambiguous conditions in a circle pattern. On the y-axis, we have the proportion of fixation to each object, or how often they were looking at each object. On the bottom, we have the object that they were looking at. So again, in noun 1, it was put the frog on the napkin. This is that area of interest that emerged right after the on the napkin phrase. And then the 3rd noun phrase is on the box. And then looking more specifically at the fixation objects, the target was the frog on the napkin in our example. The competitor in the 1 referent condition is a 2nd animal, and the 2 referent condition, it's the 2nd frog. The correct goal, which was the box, and the incorrect goal, which is the empty napkin. For this project, the region of interest that we care about is the incorrect goal, because you can tell how participants are interpreting the sentence based off of whether or not they're looking to that empty napkin. However, in noun phrase 1, 2, and 3, there's no significant difference in the proportion of fixations to the empty napkin, regardless of the condition. And we see this by the bars here all being relatively equal, showing that they're not looking at the incorrect goal more or less in any of the conditions. However, in the noun to spillover region here, we do see an effect emerging. So in the 1 referent condition, which we can look at again here for a reminder, participants who heard put the frog on the napkin looked from this frog to the empty napkin, the incorrect goal. And this shows a misinterpretation of the modifier as the destination, indicating that the Spanish-English bilinguals were affected by the referential context in this condition. So you can see that they looked more towards the incorrect goal in the 1 referent context than they did in the 2 referent context. However, between the set of the 1 referent bars and 2 referent bars, we see a difference. Within that, the ambiguous conditions did not seem to have an effect. As you can see, the 2 black bars are relatively equal, and the 2 red bars are relatively equal as well. I also split the noun to spillover region into 2 groups based on proficiency. I did a median split based on those who scored higher and lower on the Peabody picture vocabulary test. And again, we see that those in the higher vocabulary section were showing this effect of referential context by, again, having the more looks to the incorrect goal in the 1 referent condition. But in the low vocab participants, we see this difference start to go away. So based on these results, we are thinking that due to the insignificant differences between the ambiguity conditions, it appears that Spanish-English bilinguals are parsing every sentence as an ambiguous sentence. A possible explanation for this is that they're focusing on those content words of frog and napkin, and they're not as sensitive to the grammatical word of that's, which helps to disambiguate the sentence. This would be consistent with the principle of least effort and the good enough theory of language processing, which both say that people like to pay the least amount of attention that they can to achieve a parsing of the sentence that makes sense for them. In terms of referential context, we did see that there were more looks to the incorrect goal in both the one referent conditions than there were in the two referent conditions, which indicates that the Spanish-English bilinguals may be affected by the referential context that they see. As for my PIRE experience, I can't speak highly enough of everyone in the DCS lab who helped facilitate and uphold this project despite the pandemic. They helped me to develop skills in academic conversation and professional communication, and just like a welcoming work environment in general. And we also gained a lot of software experience preparing to administer the experiment online, and then in the data analysis. The life skills of flexibility and perseverance are ones I will not soon forget. Flexibility because adapting to an experiment online in a very short amount of time was like an incredible feat, and perseverance because there was never a point where anyone in the lab said, maybe we shouldn't do this or maybe we should give up. They just encouraged all of us to push through no matter what. And thank goodness they did, because we had a few exciting experiments turn out. So I'd like to thank Dr. Ducius, Dr. Connell, and everyone at the lab for their support and facilitation of this project, as well as Dr. Rosa Guzzardo of the University of Puerto Rico, Miriam Sinawa, and Heather Mann for their facilitation of the project at the University of Puerto Rico and here at Penn State, and the National Science Foundation and the PIRE grant for making this research possible. Here are my references. And are there any questions?
Thank you, Colleen. This was wonderful, as have been all the other presentations so far. Are there any questions or any comments for Colleen? So, Colleen, could you tell us about your future plans?
I can tell you what I know. So
do you mind sharing your screen that way we can see you?
Sure. So I have been lucky enough to be accepted to a few great universities that I'm looking at to pursue my master's in speech language pathology. And I'm very, very excited. I haven't officially decided, but I'm heavily considering Boston University, Northwestern University, and Temple University. So I will decide by next week. This time of next week, I'll have my decision officially submitted. So maybe there will be a more exciting update then. But couldn't have done it without Dr. Ducius and Dr. Miller, who's here too.
But we're very happy for you and hope that none of our PIRE students ever lose touch with us. Some of us are on Facebook, and you know what happens sometimes is that, you know, once the students graduate, we become Facebook friends. But it'd be wonderful to be able to know what happens in your life. So, you know, we hope that none of the students lose touch with us and with their advisor.